Hi, so my name is Izzy. Talking a little bit about regenerative grazing or holistic grazing, uh, as a lot of people call it. It's just a way of, yeah, grazing regeneratively, so it's a very broad topic. So, for the definition of grazing, we're referencing using animals being raised on pasture, which means open areas of grassland or forbs or shrubs or just any outdoor environment where we're having animals that are allowed to eat from this environment. So essentially, animals not confined to a building. So regenerative is really wide, but when we talk about regenerative grazing, the term regenerative is to regenerate the landscape. And when we referencing regenerating the landscape, we're talking about the amount of ground cover, the amount of plants overall, the amount of carbon that is being contained within the soil, because that's a direct relation of how fertile or how well that soil can support life. And also, a huge important factor is the infiltration of water into the soil because many soils, when they lack plants, will harden over and water has a really difficult time getting into them, which makes it very difficult for life to flourish. An ecosystem has many parts to it, and you need to incorporate all of them into the productivity of the overall system. And so, while plants are really nice and they're probably the largest chunk of the system in any healthy ecosystem on Earth, you have animals involved in that system, and they definitely are a contributing factor to the health of the system. And I think, having all these things working together is really complicated and we're just starting to understand it. But I think we can all agree that animals are definitely going to play some type of part in permaculture and in just creating healthy farms in general. And regenerative grazing and a lot of the practices involved with that are ways that people have found of incorporating these animals. And that's why I'm really into it, because the goal is to make, the ideal system that's regenerative and sustaining and actually is healing the earth. You're going to want it to be complete. So, regenerative grazing is really important because most of the world's land is not heavy in precipitation, and that means that it requires irrigation to be able to farm it. And fresh water at the surface that we can access is a limited resource, meaning that in large parts of the earth, it is very water intensive a lot of the time to raise both plants and animals. So being able to raise animals in an environment where you're not necessarily watering or giving them huge amounts of food is a good way of making use of space. Another one that a lot of people don't think about is that when you are setting up a farm, a vegetable farm, doesn't matter. You are essentially removing the native fauna and removing the native plants and anything that other animals would need. And whether or not it's an animal farm or not, you have to keep animals out. So every time you set a farm in place, it removes all of the wildlife from the area and destroys all of their habitat. Whereas you can graze animals and have them coexist with other animals. In my property down in southern Colorado, you'll see antelopes and cows interacting with each other, and you've got tarantulas and birds and jackrabbits, and they're all coexisting in this area. But if that was a farm, it would all be a field, and no matter what the farmer, you'd have to be getting rid of as many of those things as you could to stop them from eating all your food that you're growing. So I think it's really important to get into grazing because it's a way of making land that is productive without having to necessarily decimate the ecosystem that was there to begin with. I also think, and an even more potentially important thing, we have decimated the great grazers of the world, and about 2/3 of the world is grassland. The buffalo are pretty much gone. Yeah, there's some buffalo left, but there was like 60 million, and now there's a couple 100,000. And we've also decimated the wild horse herds that used to be all over the place. The antelope are much smaller numbers than they used to be all across the steppes of Asia. much lower. The water buffalo, a fraction of the population that they used to have. Basically, everywhere that you see these big grazers, they're just no longer there. And the thing is, animals, like I was saying earlier, are a very important part of an ecosystem. And when you have them removed, then the ecosystem begins to fall apart. And when grass is no longer being grazed in the way that it should be, a lot of evidence points to this as the cause of desertification. And desertification is when grassland, or essentially areas that experience both dry and humid seasons, become desert. It's just land becoming desert, desertification. And a lot of the world, like 2/3 of the world, is in danger of becoming desert. It can become a desert if the conditions are correct. And the other third of the world is just wet enough that you're always going to have plant life, the tropics, certain temperate areas. But a lot of the world's landmass can become desert. And what people don't think about is when land becomes desert, it releases carbon, and it releases a lot of carbon, and it stops taking carbon back out of the atmosphere. So you're not only losing the building of soil and the taking of carbon from the atmosphere. As the plants die, they release their carbon to the atmosphere. And then as it turns to sand and the sand blows away, it's more carbon to the atmosphere. And we found that, the amount of carbon that can be released by even just a couple of acres of land turning to desert is monstrous. It's a lot of carbon. And yeah, so we got to figure out a way to do this. And in a lot of these areas, there just isn't enough water. There isn't enough ways to farm on it, and we don't have the grazers anymore. So, and I'm not trying to say that this is necessarily the end all way, but it is definitely the best attempt being made right now, is by using cattle or animals of almost any kind, almost any ruminant will work, or chickens, to take the place of the grazers that we have removed. Using them and trying to mimic nature to graze in such a way that it mimics the great herds, the great animals that used to be there, and the benefits that they offer the landscape. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the benefits of grazing and their relation to the herds of animals that used to be there, and like what people are trying to accomplish by regenerative grazing. And it's like, why does it work and what is it doing? So when you have grassland and you don't have a lot of moisture, and at the end of the season the grass dies, you get left with a bunch of grass that is still standing, i.e. dead grass that's all over the place. And that dead grass, if you were to look at it from a bird's eye view looking down, doesn't cover that much of the ground. Lots of the ground, even if you look at it from a side view and it's like a big field of grass, from a top view looking down, there's a lot of patchiness, like areas that aren't actually covered by the grass. It's not like a lawn, the way we really keep it like very contemporary. So now that you've got all this dead grass that's standing there and there's not very much moisture around that's going to help it break down quickly, if it doesn't break down by next year when the seeds are coming up, it's going to be choked out by all this dead grass. You've got all this sunlight blocked off, you've got all this stuff blocked off by this dead grass, and the new grass isn't going to be able to grow up as healthy and as effectively. And the other thing is, when you've got soil that is bare and it doesn't have plants, it generally hardens on the surface and it becomes very difficult for water to infiltrate. What you need are plant roots, which break up and aerate the soil, or tilling, which is why people till. And you want to be able to work water down into that for life to grow in the first place. So when you have like these bare patches of soil, it's really bad for the landscape. And water, no matter how much of it falls, will just move across the landscape into a river and be gone in a flash. Or it goes into the soil, and because there isn't organic material and because there isn't plant roots keeping everything in place, the water will just be evaporated right back out again. It'll go into the soil, a day later, it's gone, no matter how much fell. Because keep in mind, even in the middle of the desert, you get huge rainstorms. The water just doesn't stick around. Now, if you have a grazing animal, what it does is it comes up to that grass and it tramples the grass over. And the grass is now laying flat on the ground, covering it, much like a mulch layer. If you're adding like a layer of straw, it's very similar. And that's honestly where a lot of people, I believe, probably got the idea initially, way back in pre-civilization times. And so what they do is they come over it and they trample down all of the grass, and they have it flat covering now. So now when water gets in there, and the other thing is it creates shade. When the sun is able to beat down directly on the soil, it gets very hot, and then at night it gets really cold. So it is not good for plant growth. And the fact it gets so hot, once again, makes the water just come right back out of the soil. Now, these things come up to it, they trample down the grass, they cover the ground with the grass, and it shades the ground, keeps the sun off of it, and keeps the ground cooler and insulated, hotter when it's colder. And it also helps the water to stay in there and keeps it cool so the water doesn't just evaporate as time to infiltrate. And then they pee and they poop all over it. And they eat that excess grass. So you have all that dead grass, like where does it go? They show up and they eat it, a lot of it, and they trample it over. So you're both covering the ground and you're removing lots of excess material. And then that excess material gets turned into pee and poop, which they poop on the ground and fertilizes the ground. So they essentially move to the area, help the water infiltration, cover the area up, and make it shadier, which is also better for seed germination because things are cooler and wetter. And it allows new grass to grow because it's protected from the sun. And the fertilization just kind of like catalysts everything. Now, in regular agriculture, you have, and a lot of places in like feedlots and just confined spaces, you'll keep all your cows in the same area all the time. And as they start to trample all over everything and just keep eating and keep trampling the same area, you get compaction, they overeat the plants, and you get even more bare ground, and the land just becomes destroyed over time. And even if you're having nobody grazing it, you also run into the problem where you have all this excess material that's choking out the grasslands, and they're not as healthy as they should be. But, we've tried moving around lots of cattle for a long time, and we haven't really been able to figure out how to do it in a way that's truly regenerative until more recently, when we figured out that you have to keep them moving all the time over new areas, and you really have to let the landscape regenerate before you bring them back to that area. I.e., if your grass is up here, they get it down here and trample a lot of it over. You want it to be even healthier or as healthy before you let them come back and eat it again. And a lot of people do this in a way that's called mob grazing. You take your animals, be it chickens, be it cows, goats, whatever, and you bunch them together and you control where they move. A lot of people do it in a system of paddocks, which is just a space that's set out for them to graze where they're confined to that space. And what they'll do is they'll have them move into a paddock and they'll eat all the grass and they'll trample everything over and they'll get everything cut back and they'll pee and poop all over it and get it super fertilized. And then once it's like at a level where it's been cut back pretty decently, you move them further. And you make sure that you don't return until things are still better than they were, hopefully, because you're regenerating the landscape, or at least as good before you bring them back again. And this is really good for carbon sequestration because it's helping build soil by making plant material break down, and it's keeping the soil from blowing away, because when it's covered with this mulch and it's covered with these roots, the soil stays in place. When it doesn't, it just becomes this loose, powdery substance with no structure, and hence you get the Dust Bowl. When everything's drying up, it's been over-tilled, it's been overeaten, and it all just blows away. And that's all just carbon going back to the atmosphere. So you can use these to keep the plant life healthy, keep the ground fertilized, and build soil simply by taking these animals and moving them place to place. But it's really important to focus on it as a dynamic picture, because people have been bunching animals together and moving them around for a really long time, and they've still done a lot of damage. So you have to look at it and actually see what you're doing is regenerating. Like, is it regenerating the landscape? Several years later, is the plant cover better or is it worse? If it's worse, you should probably change something. But in a lot of cases, if it's better, you can say pretty assuredly that you're helping to regenerate that landscape by adding more plants, sucking more carbon, and improving the ecosystem. And the thing is, when you improve an ecosystem, you're improving it for just about any animal in that area. And this is tying back to what I was saying earlier, is that you can have animals coexist with your uh, animal, with your grazing animals, like with your cattle. You know, you if you regenerate the landscape, so it's just a much lusher, better landscape, and your animals are only occupying each area for short spaces of time. You're essentially creating a bunch of habitat for other creatures, which is also getting restored, and you're getting meat, and you're storing carbon, and you can make use of large spaces of land that just really are not, being utilized effectively otherwise. And yeah, I mean, it can be really beneficial, at least from what I've seen in many instances, to do grazing in a proper way.